Hi folks, we're back with lecture number 14 on European imperialism on the continent of Africa. So the 19th and early 20th centuries are going to be a period of vigorous competition between a number of imperial powers that will be reaching out and trying to take control over other people and other resources around the world. So think of imperialism as empire building. That's where the term comes from. Well, what was the attraction? What was the lure for many of these powers to reach out, sometimes halfway across the globe, and take over certain regions? Well, there's a number of inducements. Economic inducements might be raw materials that could be taken from these new territories. That can include lumber or fishing rights. It might include mineral rights. During the 19th century, for example, palm oil was very much needed to lubricate a lot of these machines that are used in the Industrial Revolution, and it's in many tropical regions of the world where you can find palm oil. So we're going to see that to increase their industrial capabilities, believe it or not, you're going to end up seeing some of these European countries reaching out to subtropical areas of the world for that resource, as well as copper and rubber, oil, these things that are also helping to power the Industrial Revolution. Another economic reason was related to the question of labor. As labor movements began to spring up in Europe during the 19th century, as you see workers fighting for better wages or better working conditions, industrialists were also looking for places to move their operations in some cases. Their goal was to find cheap labor. And if they couldn't find cheap, compliant labor at home, then maybe they could find it in one of their colonial holdings, a workforce that they could control and prevent from joining unions. There were strategic and military reasons as well for taking control of other areas. The British, for example, see South Africa as, for military purposes, as a midway point between Britain and Asia for their fleet to stop in and refuel. And it's not only European nations that are getting involved in imperialism for military purposes. Take a look at the map of U.S. acquisitions and annexations in the Pacific Ocean. Many of these are tiny islands, but they're very strategically located because during the time, these coal-fired steam engines that are powering these ships crossing the globe's largest ocean, you are going to run out of fuel. You've got to have a place to pull in and refuel. So many countries are acquiring island nations for this reason, for military purposes. Another factor contributing to rampant imperialism during this era was strident nationalism. During this period, many nations felt like they were competing with their peers in a bid for international prestige. Simply put, many nations now tied their national greatness to their military might. During this period, the phrase might makes right was often used, meaning that if you can take something, then why don't you? You know, human rights concerns that we would consider today were simply just not discussed during this period. And so for nations to take over territory half a world away, they felt during this period that that reflected very positively upon them. It meant that they had a big enough navy, that they were a strong enough economic and political might, that everyone should take them seriously. And the proof was in the pudding. If they can take over these territories, then they were a player on the international world stage. Another factor that led to imperialism was the notion of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was the belief that certain human groups were fitter than others, like Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest. During this period, colonizing powers often considered their civilizations to be completely superior to other civilizations on Earth, and they considered that because they were more technologically advanced, they were more militarily powerful, that in a Darwinian sense that they were fitter, that they had outcompeted all these other civilizations, and so therefore they should come into a position of dominating others. That's just how nature worked, they argued. A particularly nasty strain of social Darwinism was the so-called Anglo-Saxon myth, whereby you have leaders of many European countries arguing incorrectly, but arguing that supposedly those of Anglo-Saxon extraction, those northern white Europeans, were supposedly superior to all other peoples. And again, to these individuals, this concept of a social hierarchy was good. It was the natural order of things, they believed. And as such, we turn to the notion of the so-called white man's burden, or the missionary motive for expansion during this period. This was the belief that there was a moral obligation among many Christian civilizations that they must go out and Christianize the rest of the world, including the African continent. And the term the white man's burden comes from a poem that was written by Rudyard Kipling, the famed children's author. This poem, entitled The White Man's Burden, was written by Kipling, who grew up in British-dominated India. If you'll recall, India had become a British colonial holding the prior century, in the 18th century. And so he saw absolutely nothing wrong, in his mind, to white civilizations, such as the British, coming in, politically, militarily, and economically and socially dominating the Indian people. And in the process, he believed this would actually benefit civilizations. They would be taught Christianity, they would be taught the English language, they would be exposed to industrialization and modernization in many ways, modern medical care. So what we see is these impulses on the part of these countries seeking to expand during this period. There's many different reasons why they do it. But above all, they believe that they're completely in the right in taking over other areas of the world and subjugating foreign peoples. Indeed, they believe that they are saving these people in a spiritual sense, in a literal sense, from sickness or disease, or helping to stop local warfare, building roads, building hospitals. They believe that they are rescuing these people. And so I want to turn now specifically to the continent of Africa in what becomes known as the Scramble for Africa, as we see numerous foreign powers descending upon this continent in the 19th century and beginning to carve it up arbitrarily for their benefit. So how are nations like Italy or France or Britain able to come in and almost entirely subjugate, bring under their domination these local populations? Well, military technology. Advanced weapons, deadlier weapons will give Europeans the advantage over native warriors. Early forms of what we call today machine guns, the Gatling gun and later Maxim guns, will be used. They're also going to use strategy in addition to superior weapons. They will play tribal chiefs off of one another. In other words, they're going to come in and exploit existing divisions based upon either ethnicity or political divisions. They're going to find out who doesn't like whom, and they're going to just nurture those disagreements so that the local populations will be so badly divided they can't unite to fight off this aggression at the hands of outsiders. Many of these outsiders who have no resistance to mosquito-borne diseases will also be aided in their penetration of the thick jungles, for example, of Central Africa by taking quinine, which was a new medical technology. It was a new way to prevent mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and yellow fever from taking hold in their soldiers. In search of new markets and raw materials, by 1900, European powers controlled most of the continent of Africa, with only Ethiopia and Liberia remaining independent after the turn of the 20th century. In 1869, the Suez Canal was built across Egyptian territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It took 10 years to complete, but now steamships can travel through the Mediterranean and through the Suez Canal and then come out in the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. This will dramatically cut down transit time and transit costs for people and goods moving in these directions. Through this process, though, the Egyptian government became unstable, mired in debt, and in 1882, we'll see that Britain will use its control over the Suez Canal Company as a way, as sort of a toehold, to begin taking over Egypt. Other powers see what Britain has done, and they say, well, if Britain can take control of Egypt, Why can't we also take a chunk out of the continent for ourselves? What we're going to see is an all-out rush among a number of powers to start colonizing areas of the continent. This is going to lead to some clashes on the ground between European countries. So in 1884, delegates from 14 Western countries, along with the United States, met in Berlin to discuss how they should divvy up the continent. No African leaders were invited to this conference. Participants met to set up protectorates and spheres of influence. Basically, they simply carved up the continent and said, okay, France, this is your territory right next door. In this particular area will be Germany's territory. Portugal will get this. And the conference also kick-started even more colonization, believe it or not, because now the principle of effective occupation was introduced at the Berlin Conference. Effective occupation meant that you had to actually have troops on the ground to claim it for your country. You couldn't just claim it from afar. You had to actually have to go in and show evidence that you were building roads, that you were building ports and facilities. And even after the Berlin Conference, we're still going to see occasional cases of powers butting heads. In the instance of the Fashoda crisis in 1898, for instance, we'll have a French expedition accidentally meeting up with a much larger British force. So we have the British and the French that kind of, hey, what are you doing here? And the other side saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought this was our territory. And fortunately, the Fashoda crisis was resolved without too much dispute. But even though these powers think that they're coming together to peacefully, in their own way, they think, try to carve up this continent, we're still going to have some head-to-head battles from time to time. So now let's start getting a little more specific and discussing particular European holdings in Africa and the devastating effects that this foreign domination is going to have on local populations. We'll begin with the area that came to be known as South Africa. It was originally settled by the Dutch, along with a sprinkling of French Huguenots, some Germans, some Scandinavians that came to this region over time. It was a good region for agriculture. It's a fairly well-watered region, relatively mild climate. And so the Dutch settlers, as they became known as Boers, you can see the term here on the slide, as they begin to settle in, they are going to trigger conflicts with native populations, such as the Khoikhoi or the Xhosa tribes. These natives don't want strangers on their land, don't want these newcomers taking up all the rich available farmland. And as you move into the later 18th century, early 19th century, the British also start to settle in South Africa. And the Dutch are not especially pleased to see one of their colonial rivals there, but the British will join with the Dutch in subjecting and subduing the native tribes to their unified political rule. This will not stop, however, a number of conflicts between local rulers and, the combined now Dutch and British settlers. The so-called Boer Wars will erupt during the 19th century between many of these tribes who are now, at this stage, desperately trying to ally and put aside their differences so that they can eject the Dutch and they can get rid of the British. This is when Shaka Zulu, hailing from one of the smaller tribes known as the Zulu, where he and his people will offer some stiff resistance to the European settlers there. However, it will be the half-nephew of Shaka Zulu, Sechweo Kampande, who will lead the Zulu kingdom on to a singular victory against the British at the Battle of Islawanda during the Second Anglo-Zulu War. Kampande expanded his army. He adopted some of the methods of Shaka Zulu, but he also equipped his fighters, known as impis, with muskets. He was willing to use European weaponry, in other words, to fight fire with fire. He also banished European missionaries from his peoples. Yet, while his people will manage to defeat the British at the Battle of Islawanda in 1879, ultimately the British had superior weaponry, they were able to get more forces on the ground, and they will be able to defeat the Zulu forces under Kampande's rule. Kampande was ultimately deposed and exiled first to Cape Town and then to London and was only allowed to return back to his homeland in 1883, 1 year before his death. We'll pick up with our story in part 2 of this lecture.